Hello, I'm Katty Kay in Washington.
And I'm Carlos Watson in California.
Welcome to When Katty Met Carlos,
a new podcast exploring what's shaping America today, brought to you by the BBC World Service and OZY Media.
Hey, Carlos.
Hey, Katty, how are you?
Good. I mean, there's actually been, this is, not a bad week because there has been quite a lot of good news in terms of the COVID vaccine. As Boris Johnson in the UK said this week, there is light at the end of the tunnel. But, of course, it is also the week that we had that awful, grim milestone, bleak milestone here in the US of 500,000 people who have died from the virus.
Yeah, it is. It's traumatic to think about and hard to hear, but I do feel like there's light at the end of the tunnel, so it's good in that regard.
I don't know if you heard it or saw it, but the ceremony surrounding those people who had died of COVID at the White House was very moving. And I was in town as the National Cathedral bell tolled 500 times, one for every 1,000 people have died. And you think, wow, if somebody had told us this a year ago, would we even have believed it?
Yeah, devastating in that way. And I still think hard, candidly, for many people to fully get their minds around. Obviously, those who've been directly impacted, whether they've had it themselves or family members have passed, know it all too well. But I think it's something that the nation will be thinking about for a while, including some of the so-called long haulers syndrome. I think that will be part of it too.
Yeah, the numbers are hard to fathom. Just to put it in some context, 500,000 people, that is about the size of Atlanta, Georgia, and the size of Kansas City, Missouri. That is what has been taken from us.
Amongst all the COVID figures, we couldn't help but notice that at the height of the pandemic, Native Americans were sadly dying at twice the rate of white Americans.
Yeah, Native Americans face worse outcomes in a whole host of different areas. Their life expectancy is shorter by 5.5 years. And the poverty rate among Native Americans is 23% compared to only 10% for white Americans.
It's not all bad news, though.
Guatsi Hopa Duhiname Itzatuitza Shuimi Hanu. Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, members of the committee, thank you so much for having me here today. I wouldn't be here without the love and support of my child Soma and generations of ancestors who have sacrificed so much so I could be here today. This historic nature of my confirmation is not lost on me, but I will say it's not about me. Rather, I hope this nomination would be an inspiration for Americans moving forward together as one nation and creating opportunities for all of us.
Congresswoman Deb Haaland could make history if she's confirmed as the Secretary of the Interior. She's been answering questions in the Senate this week, and if confirmed, she'll be the first Native American to serve in a cabinet role.
Amber Keynesba-Crotty is a council delegate in the Navajo Nation. It is the largest nation in both population and size. It spans Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. I understand, Amber, that in order to do this interview, and I want you to tell this story because it is an indication of the lack of infrastructure and services on Indian nations, tribal nations, and I want you to explain the process it took you to come and record this podcast.
So yat kia ani nishle do bilagana bashis chin des chini the shache do bilagana the chanela she Amber Keynesba-Crotty initiative for all of my relatives out there here on the Navajo Nation in terms of access to broadband or a reliable internet cell service. It's very normal to travel anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour and a half to get reliable service, to get access to healthcare, to our workspace, and also for our children to get reliable service. So that, unfortunately, is the norm here on the Navajo Nation. It creates challenges as if we do not have emergency communication, especially during the pandemic, it hampers our ability to help our people. So it just sheds light on where we're at in terms of our infrastructure and how the status of our land. It's a challenge to build anything here on the Navajo Nation.
Amber, I'd like to bring in a second guest to the conversation. Jonodev Chaudhuri is the ambassador of the Muscogee Nation in Oklahoma. Before that, he worked at the Department of the Interior, which, as we heard, could soon be led by Congresswoman Deb Haaland. Jonodev, we want to get to grips with the history here and explain for many of our listeners how past policies have led us to where we are today. So where are the Muscogee Nation originally from, and how did you come to be in Oklahoma?
Our history of Creek Nation is very similar to the history of tribal nations throughout the country, and our collective histories are embedded in the fabric of the history of the United States. So you can't appreciate the direction that the United States is going in until you fully understand the history of our nations. So prior to removal to Oklahoma, my nation was part of a strong and large confederacy that encompassed most of Alabama, Georgia, and northern Florida. Almost every policy that has been implemented by the United States has impacted my nation to one degree or another, including extermination, annihilation, the Indian Wars, removal, all through attempts to terminate and, in some cases, relocate. And so you have these watershed moments in American Indian policy that reflect a drive for land, for a drive for resources by the United States.
Would you expand on two things? One is what they call the Allotment Act, the General Allotment Act, and two, maybe even talk a little bit about some of the boarding schools, the more modern history of boarding schools as well.
You can't talk about the allotment period without talking about the boarding school period. These were two heads of the same hydra. These were two heads of the assimilationist policies that you saw in the late 1800s. The allotment policies, most notably embodied in the Dawes Act, split up my nation's land as well as many tribal nations' lands and individualized our lands and sold off the rest of the land as surplus land. Teddy Roosevelt referred to that policy as a mighty pulverizing engine. And when you think of a pulverizing machine in a quarry that takes big boulders and breaks them down to small pebbles, that was the direct U.S. policy behind allotment. Allotment took our nations and individualized them and broke our lands down into individual allotments. The same mindset was at play in the boarding school process, to take our cultures and languages and pulverize them. And they were very successful in that. My mother was a product of the forced boarding school experience. There was actually, in the late 1800s, the Compulsory Attendance Act allowed federal officials to take children and send them to boarding schools against parental concerns. That actually wasn't fully dismantled until the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed in the late 70s. And so my mother was a product of that, and her experience, I think, is very representative of Natives' experiences across the board. She ran away 8 times. Finally, after the 8th time, the officials gave up. During that time there, she faced many unfortunate events, including suffering a broken arm and things that, frankly, she never talked about throughout my entire life.
May I just jump in there? When you say your mother suffered a broken arm, she fell out of a tree and broke her arm, or her arm was broken by somebody?
It was broken by school officials. And it was part of the very severe punishments that children receive for resisting the assimilationist efforts of the school. English was her third language. Creek was her first. Cherokee was her second. When she was being forced to not speak her language, she would, find ways to express herself, and that was punished severely. And so the broken arm was just one of a series of physical, emotional, and possibly other types of abuse that my mom and her cohort faced. That said, she survived that period and used that period to inform her later advocacy. But not everybody's so lucky. The abuse from that period has been internalized by families throughout our nations, and you see that perpetuated through the generations.
Amber, if you look back at the history of the 1800s, the 1900s, they are centuries which were sort of littered with one act after another that tried, from Washington's point of view, to deal with the issue of tribal nations. What do you think Washington, America's overriding aim was in how it dealt with tribal people? What were they trying to do here in Washington?
When you take a person's language, culture, who they are, and dehumanize them, that's extermination. And I think the federal government with different policies try to, instead of just killing, straight out killing people, they killed our hearts and our minds. And they broke families apart. And our families are still struggling to recapture what was taken from us. And so we call it intergenerational trauma. And there's a long history of federal policies implemented to do exactly that. To its famous quote is, save the man, kill the Indian. And so it was very apparent in the way they took our livestock, the way they took away our way of life, and tried to make us dependent on a system that today still does not work for the Navajo Nation as we struggle with some of these modern issues as poverty, health disparities, and mental health conditions, and lack of medical resources and subpar education opportunities here on the Navajo Nation. As it relates to the boarding school experience, what we also found that the boarding school, that era, has also failed growing our own here on the Navajo Nation. So while they focused in on maybe technical skills, what we needed to see here and continue to need to see here is a skilled workforce to provide the opportunities so that we're not looking at outsiders. And the boarding schools here on Navajo Nation still exist. They've transitioned in terms of how their curriculum, but the buildings are still here, and the federal government has not, really made an effort to build up those buildings. So we have 100-year-old school buildings here on the Navajo Nation, and they don't have the adequate infrastructure needed, like broadband, to have a modern education.
I think a lot of Americans understand that there is an ancient history from the 1800s that clearly affected Native Americans after the years of independence and around the time of the Civil War. Perhaps not so many appreciate just how recent the egregious federal action was against tribal nations. From the 1950s through to the 1970s, there was the government's Relocation Act, which encouraged Native Americans to move into cities. Here's an advert put out by the federal government agency, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, in 1968.
After the newcomer has been in school or on the job for some time, he begins to feel less like a newcomer and moves about like a long-term resident of the city. Buildings that once seemed so tall are not so tall as they were. The streets that once bewildered him are no longer confusing. He has begun to feel at home upon them. Women and children who might have been fearful of the L train during their first days in the city now use it with confidence.
So, Jonodev, listening to that kind of incredibly rosy ad for relocating people into the cities, when you look at the tribal nations today, how did that Relocation Act impact what we see today? Presumably, if your people are being moved out of the nation and into the cities, how do you build up your nation? How do you keep your skills base? It's hard for me to imagine that was only 1968. It's not still having an impact today.
Oh, it's absolutely having an impact today. I think when tribal nations talk about sovereignty, they're not just talking about political sovereignty. They're talking about food sovereignty and the ability to control your own supply of traditional foods and subsistence foods. You're talking about economic sovereignty. And unless you have economic opportunity on tribal lands, the risk becomes that extermination of your culture and nationhood is compounded by the migration of your community to urban centers so that they can simply feed their families. And this all goes hand in hand. I mean, again, not every effort to annihilate involves actual, genocidal acts of killing. Most of the time, it involves undermining the economic opportunities of a nation. And one of the most famous examples is the U.S. cavalry's approach to the wars with the Great Sioux Nation. Well, rather than take them on in head-to-head battle, what did the cavalry do? There was a direct policy of killing the buffalo, the bison, that the Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota relied on. And in other words, undercutting economic opportunity, the food supply of the people. You see that in modern day. If you don't have economic opportunity on those boundaries, if you don't have the infrastructure in place, the risk becomes that there is continued migration from your nation simply so people can feed themselves.
And Amber, how much do you think the state of health in tribal nations is a direct result of things like the boarding school policy?
Here on Navajo Nation, our COVID numbers are actually dramatically different. For Navajo Nation, 1 out of every 164 persons has lost their life to COVID. And this is a direct correlation to health disparities, access to clean running water, access to fresh food, or having the specialized services that are needed. The treaty provisions, there is treaty language in there that education and medical care will be provided in terms of, we lost land, we lost opportunity, we lost resources. Our farmlands were burnt, our people were rounded up, food was taken away from us. And so our leadership then were forced to enter into a treaty, an agreement, and it guaranteed certain rights in terms of health, education, and most importantly, to protect the Navajo people. And those were the agreements made by the United States government. In terms of what we've seen historically, there has been a chronic underfunding of our medical facilities, and Congress chronically underfunds what we need to bring our healthcare into the 21st century.
Amber, if there was one thing that the Navajo Nation needed the federal government to address comprehensively, to improve the situation in the nation, what would it be? Would it be water?
Without a doubt, it would be access to water. It also goes back to our water rights and our negotiations back in the early 1920s as the federal government acting as our trustee. We have still not quantified our water from the Colorado River to meet the needs of our citizens. It would take at least over 25 years of current funding to just meet 1/3 of the need of water infrastructure here on Navajo Nation. And what this does is it dwarfs our ability for any type of raising the health disparity and access to water. We have contaminated wells, contaminated water sources here on the nation that families, because they lack the resources to transport water, sometimes 20-40 miles round trip, that then they, not by choice, but out of necessity, then have to dip into these contaminated wells and are then exposed to these heavy metals, arsenic, uranium.
It's not just water that people have to drive a long way to get, it's food as well, isn't it?
It's food. So the town that I'm in now, Window Rock, it's about 45-mile distance. So 90 miles it'll take my family to get access to a quote unquote grocery store that has at least food that's at a reasonable cost. And so we have become a nation of our traditional bases: corn, beans and squash, now a nation that heavily relies on processed food, commodity foods, and that's impacted our obesity rates, our health disparities. And so we've had to rely on international partners to come in and assist Navajo Nation with our basic needs with water, food, and other needs.
Jonodev, where is the community today? Is it in a overall relatively healthier, stronger place than the one that your mom encountered as a young woman? Are there still significant struggles that go back, as Amber was saying earlier, to some of the trauma of past times? Where are we?
Well, I wouldn't say we're anywhere near where we need to be. We need to start with an actual reckoning and an actual dialogue of how our history has impacted where we are in this moment. And this goes far beyond budget modifications and budget fills. We have to have an honest conversation, because first and foremost, I think the largest issue we have is just simply of lack of knowledge of our stories. And that's why programs such as yours are so important in addressing many of the myths about our communities. There's your average non-native doesn't always know that there are 574 tribes, or that we have lost one of approximately 475 people to COVID this year. And I mean, think of that. 2 out of every 1,000 natives have died of COVID this year. So, we're not even at the place where we can have an honest conversation about what policies need to be put into place to rectify this horrible history. And so to say that we're better off than we were, I think we're just as invisible as we ever were. So I think it starts with public education, and we can't even get to policy analysis until we have an honest dialogue.
Jonodev, let me jump in on that then. What are 2 or 3 other things that, if Deb Haaland does become the Secretary of the Interior, what could she do that would represent more substantive, important change?
I think Indian country universally wishes her the best. We need her to succeed. And in addition to any specific policies she can push, I think the most important, most critical part of her impending confirmation is that Indigenous knowledge will be front and center in solving these, existential challenges that the nation faces. In terms of sustainability, long-term planning over generations, you can't have a better framework than the native nations of the U.S. To have that approach, that perspective, is critical.
How significant would it be if Congresswoman Deb Haaland were confirmed as the Secretary of the Interior?
Well, the United States is at a point of soul searching. And as it searches its soul and searches for answers to the problems it faces, as it assesses the strength of its democracy, it has to look at the answers that Indian country can provide and has provided throughout the U.S.'s history in terms of ways to move forward. The confirmation of Congresswoman Haaland to the post of secretary is critical, not just because that department influences almost every aspect of every native's life in this country, but it's important for the United States as a whole to have somebody in that spot who has the perspective, the longitudinal perspective, to understand the role that tribal nations have played in our history and the role that Native communities and values can play in solving the problems that we face. I think it's huge, and wish her the best.
Ambassador Jonodev Chaudhuri and Amber Crotty, thank you so much, both of you, for taking the time to join the program. Amber, thank you for driving 45 minutes to find broadband that was good enough to help you join us today.
Oh, yeah, Hagonep, and may you always walk in beauty. Thank you.
Mado, it's been an honor.
Caddy, that's not a conversation I've had in a long time. So it was good. It was good to hear from Amber and Jonodev.
Yeah, I felt like we could have, another 2 or 3 programs, and it would be very interesting to look more at the present. But I think we have to understand the history, as both Jonodev and Amber were saying, and very many Americans don't know it, let alone people around the world. I, for one, hadn't realized how recent the boarding school program was. The fact that Jonodev's own mother had gone to boarding school, where effectively they try to, beat your Native American culture and language out of you. Literally beat, in her case.
Yeah, one of the things Amber was saying about intergenerational trauma is something that I'm hearing more and more about. The degree to which, our history is so often our present, even if we try to change it, is a powerful one here. And I think Jonodev is right about the need for a more thoughtful and more robust reckoning.
Yes, and it'll be interesting to see what happens to Congressman Haaland. And clearly so much hope's resting on having that representation in the U.S. cabinet. So I think it's a difficult time because there is so much happening today just in terms of resources, addiction issues, employment issues, these violence issues, and all of it steeped in legislative past and a concerted effort by the federal government here in Washington, by white people in Washington, to either wipe out Native Americans or, failing that, to have them assimilate so that they were really no longer recognized as Native Americans, but just assimilated, dispersed into the general population. And I guess that's the trauma.
Yeah, it's a conversation that I hope that we come back to again. As I said, growing up in Florida, I heard a lot about it. Part of my grandmother's family in Mississippi was Choctaw Indian, and so it's a conversation that I'm glad that we started, and I look forward to hearing more about how things can, should, and must evolve, especially given those COVID numbers.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of When Catty Met Carlos, a co-production from the BBC World Service
and OZY Media. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review, tell a friend, and of course, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you, and we'll be back soon.